this virtual event. My name is Zhang, and I am an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University and a co-founder of this Theory History Society. We are a scholarly platform for historical social science and social theory. I will be moderating today's event. We are very honored today to have Professor Jack Goldstone from George Mason University with us to present a lecture on the demographic perspective of great power politics in the 21st century. As you know, this event takes place against the backdrop of the American election, and we hope our discussion will provide insights on this critical moment through the lens of social science. Let me briefly introduce our keynote speaker and the pilot discussants. Professor Jack Goldstone is a Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Chair Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University, and he is widely recognized as a leading authority on revolutions and social change. His first book, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, Population Change and the State Breakdown in England, France, Turkey, and China, 1600 to 1850, received the Distinguished Scholarly Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Since then, Professor Goldstone has authored numerous articles and books on the demographic perspectives driving social change. We are also very honored to have 5 distinguished discussants from various disciplines joining us today. They are Ho-fung, Professor of Sociology and Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University, David McCourt, Professor of Sociology at UC Davis, Zhao, Associate Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis, and Taisu Zhang, Professor of Law and History at Yale University, and Zhou, Professor of Geography at Vassar College. So after Professor Goldstone's lecture, each discussant will provide a 10-minute comments from their unique perspective. The pilot discussion will focus on the dynamics of the US-China competition, given our audience is more concerned about this question. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Goldstone to deliver his talk.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you, Yang, for setting this up and inviting me. And I'm thrilled to have our distinguished discussants. I look forward to what they have to say. Yang, can you set it up for me to share screen? Because okay, you got it already there. Okay, so we can do that. Great. All right. Let me I'm not ready to do that yet. So let me go back a second. All right, let me just broadly set this up. I'm writing a book about the global impact of population change. And the numbers that I have been digging out of the various demographic databases have surprised even me. The way the world is changing is now so dramatic, and we're kind of on the cusp of major changes that I think we have to open our eyes and look at a different world. For the last 50 years, maybe say the last 45 years, since 1980, I think the main story in global geopolitics has been the rise of China. And China's transition from a poor, primarily rural country to a middle-income, highly industrialized country has really changed the world economy, changed world politics. China's become by far the second largest economy in the world, leaving Japan and Germany far behind. It's still not near parity with the United States. I mean, there's some data that has suggested that if you look at local purchasing power, the aggregate Chinese economy's purchasing power exceeded that of the United States. But I find that to be kind of meaningless because the purchasing power is distributed among 1.4 billion Chinese whose income per capita is really only about a fifth that of citizens of the United States. And so that aggregate purchasing power doesn't translate into international economic clout. For that, it makes more sense to look at gross domestic product measured in international dollars or constant US dollars. And in that respect, America has continued to grow. China's growth has slowed down. and China is far from overtaking the US in total output in terms of international dollars. But of course, the growth has been astounding, about 30-fold increase in total output in the last 40 years. And that has elevated China to the point where instead of being a developing country seeking to move up within the global system, China now feels confident enough to say our country should be a leader in the global system. And that's an entirely reasonable aspiration as the second largest economy in the world and as one of almost the very largest country in terms of population, only a small difference between China and India. China has a lot of clout, has a lot of weight in the world economy and the world population. And it's quite reasonable that China wants to be respected and seen as the equal of any other country out there. Now,
Jack, do you want to share your screen? Can you do that?
I checked that. I can do that. When I want to get to the slide, I'll put it up.
Okay, thank you.
So I think China, quite understandably wants to raise its position in the world. And the Chinese leadership, I think it's fair to say, by and large, the Chinese leadership around Xi Jinping feels that China is in a position of growing strength. That is, the last 40 years have propelled China on a kind of a rocket course upwards. China now seems to have advantages in everything from electric vehicles and batteries, solar turbines. It's no longer, in its own view, it's kind of no longer dependent on just being a low-wage manufacturing economy. And they feel that efforts by the United States to limit China's growth, to reduce its access to advanced semiconductors and so on, they see that as acts of aggression. And they are inclined to push back. So what we've been seeing for the last 40 years is China moving upward, the United States having a period of clear financial weakness during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and China feeling that their destiny is really to lead the world, and the United States' time as a global superpower is ending. And given, looking backward, looking at the last 45 years, I think that's entirely a plausible view. So I can understand why China's leadership feels that way. And in the United States, a consensus around China policy has formed that I think is regrettable, but I can't deny it has arrived. And that is to say, most of the American foreign policy and economic establishment now seems to view China as a hostile power and as a power who needs to be treated not as an ally in building a global system, but as a competitor and potential adversary struggling for control of the global system. And so this has led to first the Trump administration putting on tariffs and restrictions on access to certain high technology exports. And the Biden administration has continued much of that policy. And the new Trump administration looks like it will be staffed by China hawks who want to continue or even escalate the policy of trade wars and political confrontation. Now, that is subject to change. Trump tends to be a kind of deal in personalities and to be a deal maker. And he has, excuse me for a minute, he has persistently praised Xi Jinping as a brilliant and powerful person. So maybe he'll come to some kind of deal. But I think our starting point has to be the last 40 years of China's rapid rise combined with periods of American weakness have led China to seek to strengthen its position in the world. And China and America has reviewed this and decided that America has to kind of push back. Now, that is just the bilateral relationship. The rest of the world is not standing idly by. China has strengthened its ties with Russia and Iran. And that has further reinforced America's feeling that China is a dangerous adversary. The reason being that Russia and Iran are regarded as kind of dangerous, rogue or pariah aggressive states. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and that follows previous invasion of Georgia, and is putting pressure on Moldova and backed the Syrian regime in the Syrian civil war. And so Russia is seen as a country that is carrying out and aiding aggression around Europe. And Iran is seen as a country that, through its various proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and support for Hamas, Iran is seen as a country that is pursuing a path of promoting aggression, backing terrorist groups, and positioning itself as a dangerous adversary to Israel and perhaps also Saudi Arabia, which are key US allies. So I see there's a comment here. I'm not going to get into a debate about the horrors that Israel is committing in Gaza. I'm talking about US-China relations, and I don't think there's any doubt that Iran is opposed to Israel and that the United States is still treating Israel as a major ally. We can talk separately about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm perfectly open to severe criticisms of Israeli policy, but from the point of view of the United States foreign policy establishment, Iran is seen as a greater danger to the regional Middle East peace. And the fact that Iran is closely cooperating with China, being a leading supplier, and that China is helping Iran and Russia get around US sanctions is simply escalating the degree of hostility between the US and China. Now, all of that would be awkward and concerning enough. But if you start to look then at the global demographic picture, what we see is that China is now right on the cusp of an abrupt change in trajectory. From having been kind of the locomotive of the global economy and a country that was rapidly moving forward, China is now facing economic slowdown that may well turn into economic collapse. Its military manpower is going to start to drastically decline. And all of this coming right at the time that China's aspirations for a leading global role have never been higher. Now, all of you know that China is aging. All of you know that China went into the beginning stages of population decline last 2 years ago. And so, this general knowledge that China has yes? The general knowledge is that China has passed its demographic and economic peak. But I don't think people really realize how severe this is. There's a tendency to say, well, look at Japan. Japan did have an economic slowdown, but look, it's still prosperous, it's still powerful. Japan is still a major economy. It hasn't gone through any crisis. So China will be able to manage this too. But there are two big differences. One is that Japan was already a wealthy country when its demographic slowdown hit. So yes, Japan is an older country, but probably most important is that Japan's demographic aging has been relatively slow. That is to say, Japan's fertility started to turn down strongly in the 70s and has been kind of on a persistent decline. So Japan's fertility went from about 2.1 to 1.2 over the period from 1980 to 2020. China's fertility from 1970 to 2020 went from 6 children per family to 1. I mean, it's a orders of magnitude difference in the size and rapidity of the fertility decline. And that means the onset of rapid population aging and the severity of that aging in China will be much greater than anything that Japan faced. And again, China is facing that change at a time when its income per capita is much smaller, 1/3 the EU average, 1/5 the United States level. So the slogan, yes, China is going to become old before it gets rich. That's certainly true, but people don't even realize how much that's going to be the case. In about 10 to 15 years, something like 40% of China's population will be over 65. It's almost inconceivable how rapid that change is. Now, the next 10 years, from 2025 to 2035, you're going to see a huge decline in the number of young people, but the number of seniors is not going to grow quite that rapidly. And the reason is this. China's fertility started to fall from the 1970s to the 1980s. It went from about 6 to 3 in that period. But the real sharp contraction began in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the Communist Party adopted a slogan that said fewer children, later births, longer spacing. And that brought fertility very quickly from about 3 down to 2, which is replacement level or slightly below. So the number of third children in Chinese families dropped by 80% during the decade of the 1990s. So the cohort that were born in the 1980s, people who are now roughly in their mid to late 40s, that's still a large cohort. So the overall workforce is getting older, but there's still a lot of workers who are in their late 40s working in China today. But in another 10 years, those people will start to move into retirement. China is moving the retirement age up, but after 2035, people who are born in the 80s will move into their 1950s, and after 2040, they'll almost certainly move into their 60s and seek retirement. Retirement age is only going to be kind of phased in as a slow increase. People are still retiring in their early 60s. So after 2040, there's going to be a huge shift in the number of people moving into retirement as that last be above replacement cohort moves into its late 50s and 60s. And the young cohorts entering the labor force during the 2035 to 2050 period are just really small because fertility has now dropped to 1 and is still dropping. So that people that move into the, people who are entering their 20s in the decade of 2040 will be less than half the size of the cohorts that are retiring now. So in about 10 or 15 years, China's young population is going to drop off a cliff. And I have a graph to show you what's happening here. Let's see if I can bring this up. Okay, so this is a chart with colored lines. It's a little bit hard to follow, so let me talk you through this, and then I'll open things up for our discussants. Okay, so this is a graph. It shows the contribution to the global population age 15 to 49. That's the prime working age. That is, from 15 to 49, workers tend to be growing in productivity. They're able to be trainable. They're learning things. The younger ones are bringing in higher levels of education. Workers who are 50 to 60 are still contributing, but their productivity has generally plateaued. So they're not usually much of a source of economic growth. And in fact, they're generally kind of preparing for retirement. So in this graph, China is shown by this yellow line here. Now, this yellow line here, China's contribution to the global age 15 to 49 population during the China boom, say, from 1985 to 2010, boy, in 1985, China's prime work population, it was growing almost as fast as the whole rest of the world put together. This green line is the world except for China, India, and Africa. So this is the rest of the world was adding about 100 million people every 5 years to that age group. China was adding at peak about 80 million every 5 years. And that high level was sustained from the late 70s through the late 90s. Now, from the late 90s, that starts to decline. And right about now, China's contribution to that age group starts to hit zero and then dip below it. Now, as I said, from 2035 to the 2040s, there's a little bit of a return. That is, the size of this age cohort does start to increase a little bit in China. It's still negative. That is, we had this big drop to 2035, then it comes back a little bit. So there's net, not a huge decline. But after 2045, it kind of falls off a cliff. So that after 2050, China's 15 to 49 age group starts to decline by about 80 million people every 5 years. And that's cumulative. So kind of from 2025, where it starts to turn negative, starts to recover a bit, but then really falls off. If we look at this whole period, the 25 years from today to 2050, China's got a huge decline in this 15 to 49 population. Now, that's going to affect the housing market, which depends on growth in this population. It affects the military eligible population, which again, 15 to 25 is key. It affects the productivity of the labor force as a whole, because the labor force is getting older and therefore less productive. So there's this kind of huge negative demographic double whammy. That is, the number of workers in China is going to be shrinking by about 40% overall in the next 25 to 30 years. And the existing labor force is not only going to be smaller, it's going to be much older and therefore less productive. And on top of that shrinking and older and less productive labor force is a 65 plus population that will be doubling and then tripling as we get from now to 2050. So China's demographic situation is nothing short of disastrous. Now, India is seen by some people as an alternative, but India's orange line here, India's contribution to the global young population peaked in 2010. It's still holding up pretty well for the next 10 years, but after 2035, India is going to face a declining youth population as well. And the reason is that fertility in India has already fallen to replacement. So after 2035, there's no more growth. There's a decline in India's main labor force. And so India is not going to be able to move the global economy forward. Even if we look at every other place, this green line is the rest of the world other than India, Africa, and China. So this green line is Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, North America, Europe. That whole part of the world is in below replacement fertility. And therefore, their contribution to the global youth population, it peaked in 2005 and is continuing to decline and will hit zero about 2040. I'm sorry, something happened to the index here on the bottom. This 2045 should actually be all the way over here at this side. So forgive me for having the x-axis mislabeled. This whole graph actually ends at 2050. So what we're seeing here is this point where the lines kind of converge is actually around 2020, about 2015, not 2025. So I apologize for that. I did this hastily last night. But the general trend is obvious. China's young population is declining rapidly. India's will start to decline rapidly after about 2020, actually. The rest of the world has been in decline. And so Africa becomes the only place in the world where the prime working age population is growing. And in fact, from about 2025 onward, Africa will be adding about 100 million young people every 5 years to the global labor force. And the reason I point this out is if we talk about global superpower competition, the world is going to have to look to Africa for workers, for economic growth. The kind of the second wave of investment, if you take colonialism as the first wave of global investment in Africa, colonialism was overthrown. African countries are independent. but they have struggled economically for the last 50 years. Now I think Africa is poised to be the next great location of global economic growth because it's the only place in the world with a growing population of young workers. Yes, Africa needs capital. It needs to reduce conflict. It needs to reduce corruption. But China and Japan, they went through their boom period despite corruption. What they had was a combination, Japan in the period leading up from World War II to the 1970s and China from the 1980s to 2010. What they had in common was a growing, better educated workforce and an openness to global capital for investment. And I think Africa is about to enter a kind of similar phase where they have the labor is getting better educated, and the opportunities are there for global investment in a way that simply aren't there for markets elsewhere. So if Africa is going to be the next domain for growth, there's going to be huge competition already taking place. Turkey, the UAE, China, the US, Japan, Europe, they're all seeking to increase their investments in Africa. And I think whichever country is most successful in fostering economic growth in Africa, benefiting from that, integrating its economy with the growth of the African population and the African economy, is going to take off. Because I think the potential in Africa is for anywhere from $20 to $30 trillion a year in additional GDP over the next 20 to 30 years. There's no other place in the world that has the potential for that kind of growth, except possibly the United States. And the reason I say that is that the United States potentially can still have a young and growing population if it remains kind of one of the world's immigration superpowers. By an immigration superpower, I simply mean a country that has a foreign-born population anywhere from above 10% of the total. Right now, the foreign-born population in the United States is about 13%. But that's still well behind Australia, Canada, Switzerland, even Austria, which have foreign-born populations of 15 to 20%. So the United States potentially could increase the amount of legal immigration, draw talent from India, China, Africa, and America could keep its global population young and keep its economy growing. In fact, one of the most remarkable statistics is that the United States share of global GDP has not gone down over the last 20 years in the way Europe's share or Latin American share have declined. The United States share of global GDP has been constant, and I think that's only because we've benefited from the entrepreneurship and the labor and the ideas of a growing immigrant population. However, just as China is facing these powerful demographic setbacks, and again, the degree of demographic implosion in China, marriages are down 50% in the last decade. Fertility is continuing to decline. It's just astounding how rapidly people have turned their back on marriage and childbearing in China. The United States has been open to immigration, but we may now shoot ourselves in both feet by adopting a strongly anti-immigrant policy. That is, just as the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, has announced appointments of China hawks, it has also announced appointments of people who are deeply opposed to enlarging America's population by immigration. And if the United States shuts down immigration, we're in big trouble because America's fertility has fallen well below replacement. We're about at 1.6. And in fact, because we have a very expensive medical system, the costs of our senior population are unusually high in global terms. So even though our aging is not as severe, the fact that we pay about twice as large a percentage of GDP for medical care as any other advanced country means we lose the advantage of having slower aging than China. And if we get to a point where net immigration should drop to zero, the United States population would start to decline almost immediately, because right now we are relying on immigration to provide almost 100% of the growth in our labor force. That is, the US 15 to 49 population would start to decline immediately if the spigot for immigration was suddenly turned off. So this also is an issue in the geopolitical global competition. It's not only going to be whoever does the best job in promoting and benefiting from growth in Africa, but also the countries that are most open and successful in the global competition for talent and in the global effort to keep their populations young and creative. The US has an advantage, but we may lose it, and then I don't know what will happen. So let me stop there. I think I've put enough issues on the table to start a discussion. And so I look forward to hearing our discussants and questions from everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack, for your wonderful lecture. Today we have other 5 discussants which will also provide some perspectives on U.S.-China competition, as you know. So now I will let the 5 discussants to respond to your lecture, but also mainly focus on their own perspective from political economy, law, institution, the think tank, and U.S.-China history, and technological innovation. So we can have multiple perspectives about this very important topic at a very timely moment.
Yeah, okay? Can I say a couple more things before we go to the discussion? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I want to anticipate some things. First of all, let me simply say that although China has had great success in electric vehicles, batteries, and so on, having a few leading sectors is not going to rescue China's economy from the demographic disaster. That is, those leading sectors simply are not, they're highly automated manufacturing, so they're not going to provide large numbers of jobs for young people. And worse, they're unlike the low-wage factory sector, those high-tech industries are in sectors that the rest of the world wants to protect. So China is facing export limitations, and it's producing already more than the domestic market can absorb. So all of those leading tech firms are actually facing overproduction and bankruptcy. So the question on is their technology going to save China is much more complicated than just saying, oh, they're doing fine in a few areas now. Yes, they are, but those are not things that are going to help. Second thing I want to say is that the international global rules-based order that would have been a basis for integrating global economy, negotiating on climate, that's all breaking down. So I think it's going to be very concerning to say what international legal principles is China going to respect? If China is working with Russia, who is a clear violator of all international sovereignty laws, what does that mean about our trust in China's ability to follow the kind of global rule-based order? Is that completely gone? And then the last thing I wanted to say, China's leadership seems remarkably fixated on doing more of what is failing. That is, China is, Xi Jinping seems to be convinced that China rose in the world by manufacturing, so it will continue to rise by manufacturing. And he's not supporting the growth of a consumer sector, a professional services sector. And this, to me, is kind of how can China's leadership adapt to these changes if they're still following the basic principles that led to the past success? So I wanted to throw those things out there because I know our discussants will want to dig into those. Okay, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jack. I think our discussion will address those things, and we can have a discussion after their comments. So our first discussion is Ho-fung from Johns Hopkins University. Ho-fung studies U.S.-China, political economy of U.S.-China competition in the recent years. So Ho-fung, please.
Thanks, Jack. And I think I can have like 10 minutes of comments. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I agree with everything that Jack said. I'm about to dig in the issue about technology that you already said part of it, but I'm going to say that the thing is that the China situation is even more dire than what Jack portrays. Not only the population decline, but also the slow or even negative, according to what kind of measure you use of the total productivity growth. Here I want to share a graph that I recently, I cannot share, but anyway, can I like share one graph, just one graph? Make me like able to share one graph. Because the EV is, yeah, Jack is very right that we focus on EV and all these technological.
You can see it now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, here it is. So basically, so total factor productivity is a combination of capital productivity and labor productivity. So it's a measure of how efficient you use your capital, allocate your capital, and how efficient you use your labor. So you look at the comparison with earlier Asian economies. You take Japan 1951 as the point, the year zero of the takeoff. 1960 for Taiwan and Korea, and 1980 for China. You compare. You see that all other Asian economies actually grow with rising total factor productivity. The capital allocation become more efficient, productivity become more efficient, labor productivity become more efficient because of technology. And China is actually this like stagnant and also declining in more recent years. Again, depending on your estimation, there are some more optimistic estimation in which China growing a little bit of total factor productivity over the year, particularly in the 10 years after China accession to the WTO. But compared to earlier Asian economy, it is still very, very slow. So, and of course, Japan start to fall after the 1990s and 2000s, but still at a high level. So what it means is that it is actually the repetition of what Philip Huang talked about Ming-Qing China. So it is involution. So it is growth with throwing in more and more factors, capital and labor, with a declining, if not a stagnant or if not declining productivity. So China is not only running out of people, and in Korea and in Taiwan, you can see that there's a similar situation of demographic decline, but the economic growth is holding up because they compensate the demographic decline with increasing productivity. And U.S. is actually the one of the few OECD countries that has robust population growth thanks to immigration. And at the same time, the U.S. total factor productivity is actually growing much better than like UK, even like Germany now. So compared to other Asian economy and even U.S. and China is not doing very well in this regard. So the population decline, the impact is going to be compounded by this slow growth in productivity, partly because of the state financial system that has a very inefficient allocation of capital. They throw capital and all these loans to these inefficient banks and inefficient enterprise. That the more inefficient you are, that the more easier to get loan from the banks. And while the very productive, efficient private enterprise is very difficult to get loans. So it is one factor. And the other factor is that people keep talking about China is already scientific power. There's a large number of increasing number of patents. China is number one in throwing out patent. But I have been saying it, and some media is also already noticed it. I talked about it in the Clash of Empires book in 2022. And most of the patents are useless commercially, and also some of them are fake patent. And many people don't believe in me until Xi Jinping confirmed it, because Xi Jinping actually launched a campaign against patent corruption. In 2022, it's called Blue Sky campaign to arrest people who like cheat on the research grant and then get million, if not billion, of research grant, and then creating these fake patents or useless patents. And then actually Xi Jinping recognized how serious the problem is. He started cracking down on this fake patent. So the ultimate problem is the intellectual property right protection that China is trying to get there, but not yet there to protect enough to create real genuine innovation. So EV is a kind of a bright spot that people will talk about, but it is based on this kind of a state developmental model that China actually throw a lot of government resources and finance to to hundreds and thousands of EV producers. And in the end, BYD make it to become very successful, but at the expense of like hundreds of others that actually underwater, of EV makers underwater, if not bankrupt. The same story with the solar panel and things like that. So it is a bright spot of technology. And China is also very good at commercializing existing technology rather than making breakthrough of brand new technology. That US is the opposite. US is very good at making this kind of breakthrough technology, but then they don't find people to commercialize it and make it the profitable production. So it is that this kind of technology catch up of China is still have a long road to go. And they're trying to do it, but they're not yet there. Looking at the deficit and the kind of intellectual property right and the serious problem of this fake patent that Xi Jinping cracked down on it in 2022. I'm not sure in the long run how it improve the innovation system unless China get very up to speed in creating kind of intellectual property right protection system and legal system. So with all this challenge, I'm very pessimistic about the long-term decline of China growth. That is undeniable right now. And the last thing I want to say is that now that this the China collapse, people already talking about the collapse of China again. I'm against this kind of judgment on two grounds. One is that economic crisis doesn't necessarily mean, and most of the time it doesn't mean political collapse. You look at Russia, you look at North Korea, you look at Venezuela, and Iran, and all these authoritarian countries are struggling in economy. And then actually in a kind of a economic crisis situation that the dictators has a better time to consolidate its control and tighten up because the middle class is suffering and the private entrepreneur is suffering. So they have less resources to challenge the dictator. Actually, that is a situation of authoritarian consolidation, not collapse, under this economic crisis. The only case that I think of authoritarian state collapse under the weight of economic crisis is Suharto in 1998. But besides that, there's really not much. And authoritarian state in Asia, in Taiwan, in South Korea, they collapse under economic prosperity, when the economy is doing very, very well. So basically, if I was Xi Jinping, I was very happy to see the economy going down. And I'm more safe. Even Venezuela and North Korea, that they survived the worst economic crisis. And actually it's a better time. And an economic collapse in China, or even a regime change, according to many China hawks nowadays in this, is not necessarily good for the world, because there will be a chaotic situation in which it ripple through the world. So actually the best scenario for the world, I have a dark pragmatism. That is that the best scenario that we should strive for and hope for is that China going back to a situation in terms of international relation and domestic politics to a 1970s situation, that the Gang of Four is running around doing crazy stuff, but at the same time, it is cooperative internationally, it is peaceful, and having a good relation with the US, and people just waiting for Mao Zedong to die. So it is a kind of a scenario that actually can be good. That is authoritarian consolidation and getting crazier and crazier domestically. But if we make sure that it is more cooperative and less aggressive internationally, we just patiently wait for somebody to die eventually, and then after that's happened, then there might be an opening. But so it is Jack might not agree with me, but he's shaking his head, but maybe we can discuss it. So let me end here, but thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ho-fung, for your comments. Our next discussant is David McCourt, professor of sociology from UC Davis. David just finished a very wonderful book, The End of Engagement, Americans, China, and Russia Experts and the U.S. Strategy since 1989. So David is joining us from the Middle East. So David, it's your turn. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Yang, and thanks for the invitation to this. And thank you, Jack, for a really stimulating talk. Yeah, as Yang said, I'm joining from the UAE, the NYU Abu Dhabi campus, and it's a very interesting place to be watching US-China relations. And Jack's absolutely right that the rest of the world isn't sort of waiting for US-China relations to determine everything. They're getting on with things. And I was just in a panel a couple of days ago talking about greater interconnectivity in this area and trying to bring Africa into greater connectivity to the Middle East, things like the India to Middle East corridor, trying to connect India and Europe through this region as a sort of a counterpoint to the Belt and Road Initiative. So geopolitics is there, but it isn't everything. But I want to sort of take a different tack, mainly because I'm not a demographic specialist and I'm not a China specialist in many ways. I'm a watcher of Washington, as Jack knows. And so what I'm interested in is sort of just taking a little bit of a sidestep. Hopefully it doesn't derail the conversation too much, and asking the question, what do we do with this? And I'm really excited to be listening to this because it's a really nice respite from the many thousands of talks that are going on at think tanks and campuses right now on what does Trump's election mean for US-China relations. I literally just got an email while you were talking from Stanford's Shorenstein Center that are doing one today or tomorrow. Everyone's doing it. They're like, what does this mean? And it's really refreshing to actually look at something real, a demographic trend. This seems real, and to then use that to scaffold on a discussion about what US-China relations should be under Trump and what it could be under Trump. Okay, so what I thought I would do is briefly, I perhaps won't use my 10 minutes, is to ask the question of, well, what should we do with this information and what could be done with this information given the ecosystem of expert and sort of pseudo experts within the Washington beltway right now as it comes to potentially advising Trump and those people left in the wings. So let me just briefly recap the argument that I make in the book, The End of Engagement, which is to say that the engagement declined under Trump, not only because it was a policy failure, but because, and actually I'm not going to take a position on whether it was a policy failure or not, but because Trump in 2016 brought in, early 2017, brought in a bunch of experts that I call the strategic competitors. And part of the way in which they consolidated a new view, a competitive rivalry, perhaps even an enemy view of China, was by narrating a story about engagement's failings over the previous 40 years or so. So what strategic competitors, and I'm thinking here like Matthew Pottinger, Peter Navarro, Robert Lighthizer, and a bunch of others who we'd now simply call hawks, they narrated a story of engagement as this optimistic, naive view that had gripped Washington for the previous decades, that if we bring China into the international system, then all boats will rise, that China might democratize potentially and liberalize and open up. And what the strategic competitors did then was to tell a very different story, a story about Chinese revisionism, a story about increasing authoritarianism internally and the desire to export China's governance model externally too, definitely to the region and perhaps even internationally. And what this competitive view, written into documents like the National Security Strategy of 2017, National Defense Strategy of 2018, a set of speeches given by Pompeo and others in 2020, and then actually sort of furthered under the Biden administration by what we might call democratic strategic competitors like Eli Ratner, Kurt Campbell, and others. What it does is it ties together all sorts of data points like the Belt and Road Initiative, like the crackdowns on protests in Hong Kong, like events in Xinjiang, like the concern over Huawei and backdoors into Chinese tech and apps like TikTok. And so it's within that context that I asked, well, what could be done with something like what Jack just presented, and who within the Washington ecosystem can make what kinds of arguments on the basis of it. And Ho-fung, I think, actually speaks to this very issue by saying that there is a certain kind of pessimistic China is about to collapse type expert or pseudo-expert. I'm not saying who is an expert and who isn't. You can all have that kind of discussion amongst yourselves. But, you know, we all know that Gordon Chang has been saying that China is going to collapse for a long time now. And so perhaps someone like him, what I would call a pessimistic, we're in the decade of most danger vis-a-vis Beijing, a new Cold Warrior type might be able to make an argument out of this that, you know, China's on point of collapse and we really need to take that seriously. The problem with that from that sort of person's perspective is that the broader hawkish community, if we want to put it that way, or what I would call the strategic competitors, they're not necessarily in the mood to kind of be overconfident about America's own strengths going into a new administration's 4 years of competition vis-a-vis China. Jack puts forward a fairly optimistic view as long as we can remain open to immigration. Well, that does not look like it's going to happen. And again, I'm not making the case that it should or it shouldn't. I think my view is just to try to look from the outside. So another kind of person who could perhaps use this data and say, well, you know, China's actually in a weak position, might be the sort of the economic engager, which is someone who wants good US-China relations for economic reasons, who might say, well, actually, our economic advantage vis-a-vis China is very strong. The US financial markets are extremely strong. Silicon Valley is very strong. Our AI lead is robust. And therefore, we can actually be in a position to be more, again, more confident in our relations with China. We don't need to see China as necessarily going to become a true peer competitor. Although, you know, again, that the issue of whether they're a peer competitor or not enters the picture. And so my interest is not necessarily in the arguments themselves, because we all know that demographics are in part in the interpretation of them. But what kinds of China voices in the ecosystem in Washington right now can make what kinds of arguments about China's weakness rather than their strength? And so I'm a little bit hesitant to say that I'm really sure who's going to make what kind of arguments. And certainly when Trump seems to be bringing in folks who are not China experts like they used to be, right? We're not even like he brought in the first administration, Matthew Pottinger, etc., even Peter Navarro. You know, like them or not, they did know quite a lot about China. The one name that I've heard so far is Marco Rubio, who, you know, I don't think many people on this call would call Marco Rubio a China expert, but he has a long sort of interest in China in Congress. But he's not the kind of person who's going to look deeply at these graphs, nor are the people who are going to be around him, and being able to make a coherent sort of position that's going to shift the dominant narrative that really has hold of Washington right now, which is China. We're in a decade of real concern with China, where the potential for movements towards Taiwan are serious, and we're in a strategic competition with this power that wants to push us out of the Western Pacific and perhaps move into a global hegemonic position. So again, trying to put a few different kinds of questions on the table, but really refreshing to hear something not necessarily true, because we know that demographics aren't true in that ultimate sense, but real to discuss. And so thank you again, Jack.
Thank you, David, for your wonderful comment. Our next discussion is Professor Zhao Ma. Professor Ma is a historian at Washington University in St. Louis, and he studies U.S.-China relationship history for the decades. Professor Ma, it's your turn to speak.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Yang, for inviting me and put together this wonderful panel. And I have to say, I'm joining the panel from American heartland, and this is the place where people vote overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And so to just travel to this part of the country and then see supporters of the Donald Trump, and is very exciting and interesting. So I think for my 10 minutes, I want to first of all quickly maybe to kind of comments, or maybe just kind of my takeaway, from Jack, the wonderful opening lecture, and then I come back to situate our assessment of China threat or China risk or China opportunities in a more historical context. First of all, I think it's when we talk about China. And the way today we see how China featured itself in the American policy debate, and we have to understand what China is, And so I think in 2016 and 2020, those previous two election cycles, we mostly saw China as a rising superpower, and so also at the same time in the 2016 and 2020, so the U.S. was in the mire of a lot of challenges, the COVID pandemic, the election and the racial reckoning, especially the Black Lives Matter movement. But then since then, it seems that China has been through a lot of problems. Jack and David also point that out, on multiple fronts. And so some of them are systemic challenges. Some of them are kind of maybe short-term problems. So, but today we can still see, China has been through the COVID lockdown and the economic slowdown, and then even periodically the sort of a political meltdown. And so and then still we see the Chinese economy is still struggling with the low confidence of the domestic consumers and foreign investors. And so the economic recovery is kind of slow. So how do we see the strength and weakness of today's China as a peer competitor, or whether or not China can be a peer competitor, or how long it will be a peer competitor? That is a big question, I guess, for all the policymakers, and even just for us as scholars. And the big question is, how can we right size the China challenge, and then in order to come up with a proper response? So, and then now I kind of bring this assessment of China's challenges or strength and weakness in a more kind of historical context. So, I teach the U.S.-China relations at Washington University. The class covers a long period of time, from 19th century, to the present, from the early encounter driven by merchants and missionaries to the treaty port era, World War II alliance, and the Cold War, and the era of China's economic reform and the U.S.-China engagement, to the kind of the current stage when the U.S.-China relations is marked by significant volatility, swinging like a pendulum, between the Cold War-like tensions and a tenuous cold peace. So mindful of the up and downs of this bilateral relations, which are shaped by the convergence and also divergence of interest in Washington and Beijing. So we see, historically, there is a cyclical pattern in this relationship revolving around, I would say, three key debates. And so today I only have 8 minutes left, so I only talk about the U.S. side, the Washington side, and how the Washington come into the debate and what sort of the questions or what sort of the answers they got. So these debates, I think our answers to, or our understanding to these debates, and that will help us kind of study the factors that continue to drive the rhythm of the engagement or confrontation, between these two superpowers. And so the first debate, I would say, is a debate between who are we and what do we want, right? And so we are well acquainted with the overarching national narratives. When we think about who are we in the United States, it could be simply defined as we are liberal democracy and capitalism, right? And then versus who are they, right? China. And so you can always hear the term as authoritarianism or even totalitarianism, right? And so there are profound differences in legal systems, political structure, and even societal values between the United States and China. And but I want to say, the question is also, or the debate is also, what do we want, right? Mindful of the differences. And so if we shift the focus from Wall Street to Main Street, from the the compound of Zhongnanhai to alleyway neighborhoods in Beijing or in China. And so as the most basic level, the American and Chinese people, they ask sometimes similar questions. And so as people everywhere in the world, how to live and extract a good life from a stubborn environment, how to organize human society to facilitate human relations and preserve peace and order, how to balance the power of government and the force of market between this visible hands and invisible hands when allocating resources and developing opportunities fairly for everyone, and then how to weigh the needs of individuals against the broader interest of the society as a whole. And so, for quite some time, and the answers to these debates, these questions, especially to who are we, that would definitely impact our answer or our perceptions of who not just we want, but also who they want, right? And so this is because the difference between the United States and China are sometimes people feel, especially these days, people feel that I think the debate today or the emphasis today is more on because we, US and China are so different and so fundamentally different, right? That's why we tend to overlook or ignore, right? And so how in certain areas, we actually what we want are aligned with each other, and that can provide interesting dialogue or mutual sort of some kind of cooperations. But that's kind of the first debate. The second debate in this U.S.-China relations is, should we work with China or how can we work with China? I think the answer up until Obama administration, and especially from Nixon, is yes, we can work with China despite our differences. And so we agreed to disagree. And so, because there's a Soviet Union, and then later in Clinton administration, there is the global economy, right? So those are the things that can help us overcome those differences, or we can put aside those differences, and then to see how two countries can work with each other and to provide some common goods for the global public. And so, but I guess, starting from of course, from Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and also later the Biden administration, it's the answer to Biden is it depends, how to work with China. And so it's initially that he proposes competition, cooperation, and confrontation, 3 different buckets. So later it was redefined as invest, align, and compete, under 3 baskets, So I think Biden was trying to compartmentalize problems while seeking areas of convergence of interest and trying to do something collaboratively, in certain areas. But I think moving now in the upcoming Trump administration, we can likely to see a new Cold War, whether this is going to be a capital letter or lowercase, that will be up for debate where we can see. And but I think at this point, it's more sort of not just we work with China, right? But it's just we don't want to work with them at all. It's all about a competition. And so the third debate, and it's should we bring China in or should we keep China out? And so I think David already mentioned that the era of engagement, right? This is sort of the era we try to bring China into this American-led rule-based international system, and then hopefully somehow this engagement, this kind of integration, will produce the results that would basically turn China more like us, right? And so, but now the answer is more like how do we keep China out, right? And so in what areas, at what cost, and when, how fast we can keep China out. And so there are a range of examples to see how this is also part of what we see one of the significant Biden legacy. Right. So the legacy is, even though Biden is, quite different from Trump, in his approach to foreign policy, but on the one hand, he inherited pretty much everything Trump put in place, with regard to the China policy, right? But he did more, right, by institutionalize those barriers, those sanctions. And so, the examples are a lot, so you'll just take a look from the moving or refusing to reinstall Fulbright programs in mainland China and Hong Kong, or moving the language flagship programs out of China, put this in Taiwan, or just most recently, I would encourage everybody to check your university's compliance requirement. So you will see how the way you engage with your colleagues in China and the way you travel to China will be deeply and profoundly impacted by this new federal regulations. So I think there's I would call China exclusion, not Chinese exclusion, but China exclusion, right? And is emerging at the federal and the state levels and across the country. And so, and once this China exclusion is completed, and so this will stay for a long period of time, as we see from the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, 100 years ago. So just kind of in 1 minute to summarize, in a 2018 article published in the Financial Times written by Henry Kissinger, who said Trump may be one of those figures in the history who appears from time to time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretenses. Okay, so I think we can see. Trump has a track record of pushing boundaries, challenging established red lines, questioning long-standing agreements, or disregarding diplomatic guardrails. And so he injected, in just his first term, he injected a lot of volatility and uncertainty in the in this bilateral relationships with China. So now his cabinet picks so far is. There's quite a lot, sort of loyalists and also the prominent China hawks, So it demonstrates to me that he is having a sort of a mandate, or at least he believes he has a mandate, right? And that asks him to be even bolder, to rock the boat, in Washington, in the transatlantic relations, or around the world. So in conclusion, I guess those three debates are over at this point, and we might come back to those debates in 20, 30 years. That's kind of how the history of U.S. relation goes. Every 30, 40 years, you go through the cycle, right? And so I kind of pessimistic at this point. And so I think in the near future, we will have a rocky road ahead. And so let's everybody try to fasten our seatbelt. And then we'll come back to this in 20, 30 years. All right, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Ma, for your whirling and health way. Our next speaker is Taisu Zhang, professor of law and history from Yale University. Taisu not only studied early modern, great divergency, but also contemporary U.S.-China, political economy and law-related issues. Taisu, it's your turn. Thank you.
So thank you. So first of all, thank you, Yang, for organizing this very interesting talk, timely talk as well. And thank you especially to Jack for the highly illuminating comments, and also to Ho-fung for pointing out the TFP decline. That particular chart is a chart that I have not seen before. Like I've seen other charts about TFP decline, and it didn't make it look quite so dire. But I guess when you think about it from a different kind of measurement perspective, it seems even worse. So I guess like in terms of like basic big picture assessment, I have no significant differences from what's already been said. I think anyone who's been paying attention to Chinese demographics and economic trends in the past 5 years has frankly no choice but to be rather pessimistic about future prospects. I'm not naturally inclined to be such about my own country's growth prospects, but I think at this point it's pretty much unavoidable to have more downsized and more negative sense of where things might be in 5-6 years. Now, the one place where I might add a bit of perhaps political complexity is it's kind of hard to project what the Chinese government's response to all of this is going to be, and maybe even harder to project what the US response to the Chinese response is going to be, right? Like it's kind of like when looking at these broader long-term trends, you constantly have to remind yourself that, frankly, China's demographic decline, yes, resembles in many ways like other trends in other East Asian East Asian societies, but at the same time, it was also supercharged by a one-child policy that was, frankly, of its own doing and had no parallel in any other country of this kind. So there are certain things about the nature of the Chinese regime and the nature of the Chinese regime's capacity for big, decisive, paradigm-shifting action that don't quite exist in most other countries, especially not in democratic societies. So correspondingly, there's a real question as to what exactly would be the response to this kind of current TFP slow decline and much more precipitous demographic decline. Now, on the side of boosting productivity, you could possibly argue that this is what the current wave of state-sponsored industrial upgrading is designed to combat. There's a narrative about Chinese TFP decline from the previous 10 years when it when it really began to fall after 2010, that this was the consequence of kind of like a property bubble fueled growth model, and in that you have fairly rapid growth in services, you have most of your growth tied to property inflation, and naturally, because of the extremely capital heavy nature of that kind of growth, that doesn't lend itself very well to TFP growth. So there's a school of thought in China that doubling down on high-tech industrialization might reverse some of this decline and might not be able to get it back to the kind of robust growth that you saw from like 1998 to 2008, but it might not necessarily be quite as dour as, say, like the World Bank's projections show it to be at the current moment. Now, the demographic thing is obviously much harder to predict and to envision. You could probably argue, like there up to this point in human history, there have been, at least like up to this point in modern human history, maybe not even modern human history, but like up to this point in post 1980 human history or like post mid-level development human history, there has never been a successful example of a government policy actually managing to stimulate demographic growth organically, domestically, in any kind of substantial way, right? I think, as Jack would probably agree, like the history shows that any kind of you basically have two kinds of countries that manage to become wealthy, but at the same time don't suffer massive demographic declines. One is immigration-based societies like the U.S. There's an argument that Europe, if it manages to solve the social tensions that come with immigration, might have an opening towards that as well. But all that's kind of debatable. The U.S. is certainly coming into its own period of immigration-driven socio-political tensions, and it's not quite clear when exactly it's going to be able to emerge from that. You could make an argument that the U.S. might emerge from that in as quickly as like 4 years, because given the overall headwinds faced by the U.S. economy in the short term, given the overall global downtrends, it's very likely that any incumbent, including the Trump administration, is going to lose the midterms and then lose the next election. And so you could possibly see a swing back in 4 years. But then, like, if you're going to keep seeing these swings, then overall the net effect on U.S. immigration is kind of hard to predict, especially if the next generation of American like anti-immigration populists like Vance are probably going to be more hard-nosed and frankly competent than Trump has been in executing that kind of agenda. They're not going to nominate Matt Gaetz's or like Tulsi Gabbard's to high-level positions. They're not going to trigger that kind of political strife. Only Trump's crazy enough to do all that, or only Trump is transactional enough to do all that. And so in some ways, like if you're hoping that the right-wing populist movement in the U.S. is not going to kill off immigration in any meaningful way, Trump might actually be a bit of a reprieve from what otherwise could have happened. But leaving all that aside, the second model, obviously, is Israel, which is completely different in that it has a very, most of its demographic growth is coming from the highly orthodox sector of the Israeli population. That can't really be replicated anywhere else. And you could say, sure, even the secular, or less religious parts of the Israeli population still have a birth rate of above 2, but that's probably because there are cultural spillovers from being adjacent or proximate to the highly orthodox sectors of the Israeli population. So none of that is replicable in China. Anything else that people have tried, stimulus, stipends, tax breaks, any kind of positive incentive doesn't seem to work, right? Like Japan's tried virtually everything you can imagine. South Korea is beginning to try virtually everything you can imagine. The Northern European countries that have been spending decades trying to engineer this kind of thing, nothing's worked. Which begs the question, is that necessarily going to be the case in China as well? Common sense would seem to suggest that maybe the answer is yes, but I'm not entirely certain about that. I mean, I've been to meetings in China where stimulating demographic growth was the main topic, and all I can say from those is that the range of tools and mechanisms that people have discussed in these small, relatively high-level Chinese intellectual or sometimes even policy meetings, there are policy meetings back in the day where scholars were invited to, and I sat in at least one of these several years back. And the stuff being on, they were quite cognizant of the fact that positive reinforcement or positive incentives generally don't work on their own, at least. So what's being pitched in China is basically positive reinforcements paired with very heavy negative penalties for not getting married, not having kids. Now, the reason why this has never been really tried in other countries of this stage is that most countries get to this stage when they're this wealthy and this developed, they're usually largely democratic in terms of politics. And you try this kind of stuff in a democratic polity, you're asking to be killed in the next elections, no questions asked, right? So no one's ever tried this kind of thing. So we don't necessarily know whether penalties for not getting married and penalties for not having kids are actually going to work. But they are, I'm fairly certain that they're kind of on the table for Chinese policymakers. Now, you can imagine this could also backfire majorly in that if you try this, the population has an even bigger backlash, and the younger population tries to emigrate. The Chinese government does have ways to shut that down. I think the gist of my comment is, the Chinese party state has vastly greater control for its population and its domestic policies than anything that any Western democratic regime, or frankly, even any Western not so democratic regime, could possibly envision. It's certainly far beyond what Japan and South Korea could try, given the state of their politics. So there's that to me is the uncertainty, right? If they go down that route and basically become very oppressive in terms of demographic policy, whether this long-term demographic decline is maybe not quite reversible, but at least you can slow it down to a much larger extent than we currently deem possible. And if that's the case, then the narrative shifts yet again. And you'd have to wonder whether, at least in the next maybe say 10 years of US-China relations, Chinese material decline is really actually going to materialize in quite this fashion. Because, in terms of US-China relations, given that everyone's at this point mainly focused on the short term, there's a bit of long-term planning on both sides, but the short-term tensions are so acute, especially surrounding Taiwan, that exactly where your demographic projections are for the next 5-10 years is really going to matter, right? If they fall off as sharp as they currently seem to be falling, then you could very likely argue that there's going to be very little appetite for military hostilities or so on and so forth on the mainland, and that would lead to a very different set of circumstances than if the mainland deemed that it can slow things down just enough that there's enough social tolerance for maybe a military campaign or something much more something more robust than what currently seems to be the case. So again, given the very fine margins of decision making in both DC and Beijing these days, I think we have to be a bit more imaginative in the range of demographic outcomes that we're willing to entertain here. Now, again, that's not saying that I find any of this terribly likely. The social scientist in me would probably say that the sharp decline that Jack illustrates that everyone seems to agree with in the demographic world is still by far the most likely outcome. It's just that there are certain kinds of political variables that are present in the Chinese case that are not anywhere else. And I'd like to just lay those on the table a little bit. And that's my comment. And thank you guys for bringing me into this conversation.
Thank you, Taisu, for this comments. I think there should be more exchange after our last but not the least speaker, Professor Yu Zhou, geographer at Vassar College, to give her comment. Professor Zhou is an expert to study technological innovation in China and the United States. Professor Zhou, it's your turn.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's rare to have a geographer in this kind of a panel, so appreciate Zhang Yang's invitation. And as someone who are different discipline, and I actually my take going to be quite different from the Bob talk. So it's good to have someone. Hopefully, you guys think it's good to have someone disagree. Just very quickly, because my topic is on China, US, on technology, I might just share the slides. I like to have slides so that way people don't look at me as much, nearly as much. So
Yes.
anyway, I think just quickly, because demographics has been a topic on everybody's mind, I just want to remind everyone we're also in the cusp or in the middle of a major revolution that is AI revolution. So to what extent labor as human labor in playing the technology or changes, social, technological, and everything changes, that it's going to throw a lot off. And which we are seeing in China already in terms of manufacturing. We talk about EV, have hardly any workers. We talk about ports. So let's not forget AI is going to throw off what is the role of labor, human labor in that process. Okay, so and in terms of, I do agree that the competition with China and US, China-US relation going to go through a turmoil period. There's no question about that. And the question is, how do we think about frame China in the US in the tech competition? This is yesterday's New York Times article, which is somewhat captures some of the you were saying, like China is declining power, US economy, meanwhile is gaining momentum. And China's economic hope outdated state subsidized manufacture for export model is the one he says is very vulnerable to tariff. Although I disagree with the last model, I think the idea that to say China's economy is an outdated state subsidized manufacture for export model is probably 20 years out of date. So what I'm going to is recently there are quite a few of the, I actually have to do this, right? So there are several recent reports on China technology advances. I'm going to cite 3 that seems to be quite influential. ITIF is a new think tank, Information Technology Information Foundation, which took 20 months studies that tracked the 9 industry that find China leading 5 or globally competitive, and the other 4 China is lagging but rapidly catching up. Bloomberg, everybody knows, studied 13 industry over a year, find China leading in 12. Or globally competitive. Only commercial aircraft is lagging. Australia Strategic Policy Institute has a critical technology tracker, says China beats the West in 37 out of 44 technology tracked, 19 out of 23 technology industry. So these are, on the left is ITIF summary, on the right is Bloomberg's. So all 3 have different technological methodology and define their sector differently. And so we have some mismatches on those, but I think if you are Washington, these are, ITF had a congressional meeting, and Bloomberg, of course, is very, very influential. Australia's report being cited across the world from Japan to other guys. So we're looking at 3 assessments that are also going to make Washington decision maker very uncomfortable in terms of technology catch up. But we're not looking at a small number of sectors. So this is ITF's conclusion. China is rapidly becoming a leading innovator in advanced industry. ASPI, Australia think tank, China built a foundation to position itself as the world leading science and technology superpower. Are U.S. effort to stymie China's technology rise working? Not really. So what does that mean? I think one thing it means that, people are going to be uncomfortable. So the idea that somehow the DC would think, oh, China is not a threat anymore. That's, technologically they're going to fall off, demographically or whatever. That's not going to happen. So based on what we see here, right? I have read this report pretty carefully. I find some common policies and trends, I think it's a policy, but, in this report, so I'm not talking a report to say, okay, China has outdated model. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about think tank who spent more than a year study China's technology through export interviews, through tracking, through digging through a lot of data. Okay, so what are some of the common fallacies? What I thinking in framing and explaining China technological competition? First is sort of the idea that to imagine technology competition as a race on racetrack. So you have a lot of talk about who wins, who loses. This is a defined track. If you're on this track, well, partly it has to do with their I think the methodology, right? So you have a tracker, you track who's ahead, who's behind. So in that sense that, we can, all these reports talk about winner and losers, right? As if there's a defined finish line. The problem of technology development, as all of you probably know, that it is about innovation. It is about taking shortcut. It is about open new lanes of competition. It is about responding to the conditions on the ground. So I have not seen many Chinese entrepreneurs saying, my goal is to be the first in this particular technology. Most Chinese entrepreneurs say something different, like, okay, what is my market? Do I have a scenario that I can fit my technology in? And so do I have a market? Could I sell? And what problem I'm trying to solve, maybe which I can get some support. So this sort of idea of tracking technology, who wins, who loses, limit our imagination of technology as if this is a race for the primacy, but rather technology is developed to solve problems. EV is developed to solve the problem because China's air pollution, because it's oil insecurity. It's not because they, somehow EV, they think that 20 years ago that they're going to dominate the world. I'm sure there's some people think that way, but most entrepreneurs weren't thinking about that way. So to limit that is a huge limit of our imagination, what can happen. And also on a race, people don't help each other. So just so you know, but on technology development, people do collaborate. The second, and I think that I kind of also hear that too, is this really, really assigned, I think unfortunately our analysts assign way much foresight and effectiveness of Chinese government. That if you look at as if they have this crystal ball, and that's when ITF, the rapid innovation progress stem from Chinese Communist Party's determined effort to dominate the global market. in host advanced technologies. As if this government doesn't face the problem of limitation, they can think 30 years ahead of the time. And those of us know China knows that's not the case at all. And then there is overemphasis on subsidies, and that's Bloomberg, like, oh, Chinese subsidize this industry, therefore they're successful. And Ho-fung talked about, which I totally agree, China subsidized a lot of industries. Most of them did not successful. So there's a survival bias in that assumption. You know, you look at something is successful, you say, oh, because subsidies. Well, subsidies put in many other industries, it did not. So what what it misses is the incredible creativity at Chinese society and the incredible ability of flexible changing and its situation. So that's sort of completely throw off. And that, if you do throw off that, you don't understand why China, you know. The third is sort of a national perspective in some ways, that to sort of thinking about, this is again ITF, which have like over 100 pages. So the idea if China can become an innovation leader, that development poses a significant threat to Western nations and their firms, because China will be able to combine quality innovation prices. So, but what that actually meant is competition. So, you know, if we think that is the prices is really a threat, then we just have to limit the competition. And it was interesting, ITF also asked the question, well, what if Chinese pharmaceutical companies start to be able to cure cancer? I follow pharmaceutical companies, so I do know that's the big area that they invest their energy and money. And then he's like, you know, the report says, if China can help cure cancer, but what if that drive down the profit of American pharmaceutical company? And I think if you're waiting, which one is more important, cure cancer and the profit of pharmaceutical company, I think you should have your brain examined. That I'm saying this even though my husband works in pharmaceutical company, so I do have a personal interest for them to make money. So, but anyway, I've been tracking China's technology development for many decades. That my approach is to look at the industry development, tracking them, and then individual company and so on. So recently, I'm gonna publish a paper that is looking at the sort of China. Where is China dynamism coming from, and which is quite different from Silicon Valley. This is in print, will be published next year. So I coined a dream model, a DREAM. This is not a dream, this is a summary. So the D refers to a dynamic dialogue between the state and market. So right now we're looking at Xi Jinping, and the idea is that he's dictating everything. But if you look at China's development in the past 30 years in terms of what is the state relationship with the market, you have to conclude that the state in many ways were not dictating the process, and they were in many ways behind and reactive to the market situation. And they certainly play some roles here and there, and a lot of roles in many areas if we can go to detail. But thinking about, there is a dialogue between state and market. State may not act effectively, it may not act on time, but it does react. So it's not a sort of a one-way street always in 30 years. R has to do with China's increasingly shifted to domestic research, moving, somewhat reduced the relying on import technology, which is pretty much a dominant trend from 90s to 2010. So, and partly for necessity, because the decoupling, various trade restrictions, partly also because the rise of research capacity, as well as the need for conducting more research that evolves more after 2010 2007. Right, so the R has to do with increasing relying on domestic research. The E is interesting. It's the industrial ecosystem. So any innovation economy require ecosystem. But what is striking is China's ecosystem quite different from Silicon Valley. I think Ho-fung talked about the IPR. China's IPR is a mess, for sure. It does apply a lot of patent, but yes, a lot of them are not useful. But it's also important to realize that Chinese innovation is far less rely on protection of IPR and the venture capital, which dominates the Silicon Valley. Why? How did company not having IPR would willing to innovate? This is a question I think we need to open up our mind to think about what other things are incentivizing a company to invest in innovation, because you are in a context IPR protection isn't good. So, but yet you're looking at the situation Chinese company continue to innovate despite the fact. So what other mechanisms rather than apply blindly the idea from Silicon Valley, the framework from Silicon Valley? A has to do innovation driven by cumulative changes. It is true Chinese companies are not good at breakthrough innovations. They're not perhaps interested in breakthrough innovation, but they're super good at the cumulative changes, which iteration of technology to bring it on the ground, to spread it in scenario, different markets, right? So cumulative changes across companies is much more characteristic. It's about Chinese innovation style. M has to do with the middle income market. I think Jack mentioned about Africa, right? So Africa is part in the play. So Chinese company were never good about innovating the best product for the first product in the world. What exceptionally good is focusing on affordability and the functionality rather than cutting edge technology. So to bring the price down so it can be consumed by middle income population in China, elsewhere in the world. So you see it across the board into almost all industry, from drugs to cars to electronics. So if Jack is right that demographically developing country, Africa, others are going to grow, that means the middle income market is actually expanding quite dramatic. So this is something we see it from I see it from 1990 all the way to now. That's what China does. So in that case, does Trump's tariff and export control will completely doom China's innovation? Yeah, perhaps it will change the larger picture, but I actually don't see it fundamentally affecting all these 5 ingredients. So I know I'm totally off in this particular session, but I'd be happy to hear your comments.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zhou, for this wonderful presentation. Now we have like 20 minutes left. Jack, would you want to respond to this comments maybe for like 4 or 5 minutes? Then we can open to questions from the audience.
Yeah, it won't even take me 4 or 5 minutes. Let me say that I think there is perception that China is weakening and not rising. And the result among Craig Singleton yesterday in the New York Times and the other China hawks is good. Now we can really beat China once and for all. I think for the reasons that Professor Zhou mentioned, that's foolish. No, we can't beat China once and for all. By cutting off supplies of semiconductors, China is being forced to develop its own semiconductor industry at a faster rate. We're going to push China out of developed markets. They're going to go into middle income markets. And of course, when you confront a wounded tiger, I think we increase the chance that China will strike at Taiwan to embellish its nationalist credentials if we push it into being an adversary and persuade China that the US is somehow going to win. I think Professor Zhou is right. If we view this as a competition that's either win or lose, we're going to create both of us losing. It's more like a prisoner's dilemma than it is a road race. So I agree with a lot of what Professor Zhou has said. What I think the problem is that a lot of those things that worked for China for the last 20 years in the dream scheme, I agree China's growth was bottom up. It was led more by firms, not by the government. The government is now exerting more control. The government is now losing some of the creativity and resources from the local governments that help drive Chinese growth because the local governments are so heavily in debt. And to get to Professor Zhang's point about China being able to be more coercive about fertility, yes, we've all thought about that. The problem is you can't change the labor force in the next 20 years by anything you do today. What happens for the next 20 to 25 years is locked in. If you suddenly say, okay, no one's going to be allowed to join the Communist Party unless they have 2 children, no one is going to get promoted in a state-owned firm unless they have 2 children or more, that will change behavior, no doubt. But it will force women out of the workforce to spend more time having kids. And it will take 10 years, maybe 5 or 6 years before they have those 2 children, and another 20 years on top of that before those children join the labor force. So my graph ended at 2050. China can't do anything to change that. And of course, if they do adopt those coercive rules, the reaction may be a backlash, especially by women. So it's not clear that China could simply say, well, look, the CCP is in charge. We pushed fertility down, we can push it up. Even if they could, in the short term, it would worsen the labor force, not help it. So I'll stop there. I think questions, let's go.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Any questions from the audience? You can raise your hand to talk, or you can put your questions in the chat. Anyone has a question? Maybe let me start with a question. I taught carpooling is great transformation this week in my global governance class. So my question for Jack and maybe for other discussion too, are we, the situation today close to the situation in the interwar period in 1920s, 1930s? Would you make a comment whether we are heading to some very dark time like the 1930s? Jack, would you?
Yes. I mean, yeah, we are. I've written a couple of papers saying we're in a situation like the 1930s. We're seeing aggressive military action in several regional theaters. We're seeing the rise of authoritarian governments. We're seeing a rise of ethno-nationalist populism. It's very much like the 1930s. I think the Syrian war is a lot like the Spanish Civil War. It was a case where you had an authoritarian regime under pressure, and the West, that is England and France in the 1930s, did not rescue the Republic. Instead, support from Italy and Germany helped the Franco dictatorship win that conflict. In the same way, the Syrian opposition didn't receive much support from the West. Russia was able to back the Assad regime and lead the dictator to succeed. So kind of demonstrating the weakness of Western democracies and the strength of authoritarian governments. So I think that's the model we have. I hate to say it. It scares the whatever out of me that we're in a 1930s like situation, but the world got through it, and after World War II everybody was more peaceful and prosperous than ever before. So we may go through some, we're in a horrible war in Ukraine. There's horrible things going on in Sudan. There was a disastrous war in Ethiopia. I think there probably will be a military confrontation in the South China Sea. So, someone said, buckle your seatbelts. I would say put on your crash helmet. It's going to be bad for a while, and we just have to hope we come out on the other side.
So can I ask why the appropriate comparison is to the 1930s and not the 1970s, right? Because the 1970s saw much of the same thing, rising authoritarian regimes across much of the developing world, Middle East, Southeast Asia, so on and so forth. Significant domestic crises in both of the major powers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The main difference between the 1930s and the 1970s, of course, is nuclear deterrence, right? Which is a much more apt parallel to the current day. So why not the 1970s then?
The 1930s was a period of a kind of more multipolar world. The domination of Britain was fading. America had not yet established itself. It was a bit more of a free-for-all. By the 1970s, it was pretty much a superpower competition between the US and the Soviet Union that was operating through proxy conflicts around the world. And within the United States, despite all the civil rights problems and so on, there was much more confidence in basic American institutions on the part of Americans. America was not nearly as politically polarized as it is today. So some major differences. We have a lot of hands up now.
Yeah, that's true. So now we have three questions from the audience. I will let them ask together, and then the panelists will respond to them. Professor Yue, our first question is from Yuenin Wu. Please unmute yourself and talk. Yuenin, you are
Hello.
okay.
So hello, I'm Liz. I'm a senior student in my high school, and this is a question for Professor Ma about Chinese economy and its prospects in the coming years. So, as you mentioned, the U.S. is facing this very tricky decision if either bring China into the global market or to keep it out. I feel like it's just not plausible to achieve this very obsolete situation that, to entirely make China detach from the global economy for its long-term engagement in it. As I heard from Samuel Goldstone has this very famous theory of including me out, emphasizing on the ambiguous but strategic in-betweenness of a certain state. I was wondering, would China also have this opportunity to, be both engaged yet detached in a sense to, achieve the state of ambiguity in betweenness? So yeah.
Thank you, Yuenin. Let me collect two more questions. David, unmute yourself and talk.
Is that me? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I thought I took 2 points from the presentation. One is that the Chinese economy is slowing down, probably because of a lack of demand, lack of adequate demand in the consumer sector, and that has something to do with their fixation on raising money through selling land rather than progressively taxing their income base. And then I thought, maybe that we are. I mean, it appears from the last speaker, Zhou, that we are in fact behind technologically. I mean, I noticed that we initially said, well, the Chinese can't make cars now. They're selling Chinese electric cars in Mexico, but we won't allow them in because they're too competitively excellent. So there may be something wrong with our model for generating technological progress, and that is it may be too materialistic. I mean, we assume that money is the major reason why people engage in creative technological research, and that may be an error on our part. I mean, I say this based on my own experience as a sort of black sheep sociologist who has not been receiving any rewards, but yet is motivated to do all kinds of work that I at least have a high regard for. Thanks. That's the essence of my comment. It's in the chat also if you're interested.
Thank you, David. Our final question from Zhao. Would you unmute yourself and speak?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for all the presentations. I am a PhD student from Tsinghua University, and now I'm visiting at Harvard University. I personally really like Dr. Zhou's presentation since this perspective from technology has solved my problem since I arrived as American. So basically, when I was in China, I feel like people are not really optimistic about Chinese technology development. People would say like, oh, you say like OpenAI and ChatGPT, they did a really good job, but like for like the Baidu and the Wenxin is not so good. But I think Professor Zhou has provided me like a very good perspective that I know like this maybe this is like China and has like a really different way of innovation. It's like it is a cumulative one rather than breakthrough, but it can also like can be a very good strength. So my question is like you just mentioned that you feel like the government has played a different role in the history of China in its relationship with the markets. Like it's more like a dialogue with market. But I'm wondering if you can just show more perspectives about how like how it has changed for these recent years. For example, you can say that the policy like build a big market, 统一大市场, this kind of policy. It has like a very maybe has a different relationship between the government and the market, and how it will change maybe the China's economic development and its relationship with US in the future. And I have another question about the demographic part. I also feel like a very contradictory narrative in China and in the domestic of China and in US. I feel that scholars in US, in the Western society, they pay more attention to this problem. They are more worried about like the demographic decline and the decline of birth rates. And my question is, since I think most of my classmates and my friends in mainland China, they are also considering that they cannot find a very good job, even if like they are well educated, they are just not much good positions for them. So I'm wondering that considering this currently declining birth rate, will it be an opportunity for China to change its like market, its labor structure, just to maybe this well educated like young graduates can have like better and good jobs than before, because you can say the labor force is like declining. Maybe it's an opportunity. I'm just not sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So I will let Professor Ma, Zhou, and Goldstone to answer the question briefly. Professor Ma, would you start?
Sure. Yes, it's a great question about this. I mean, this is really a hard question, or this is a hard decision for either Beijing or Washington. This in and out. And I think it's on the one hand, it's we see actually China is doing the same thing. If you look into the Chinese ecosystem, the financial ecosystems, and so China is trying to kind of decouple itself from some part of the American market, and trying to make itself less vulnerable, or over dependent on American technology. And so the larger issue here is just how to see. I mean, China presents a unique challenge to America at this point, and because it's politically different but economically interdependent, this is the first time for U.S. to see how to handle this. And I think at this point we see there's the lack of imagination or the lack of solutions on the part of Washington. So that's why for the Trump administration is the across the board sort of cutting China out and trying to force a decoupling and on all fronts. And then for Biden, he's trying to do maybe to get it both ways, to keep China in certain part of Americans sort of ecosystem, the market, but then try to reduce the risks. That's what he calls de-risking, right, and not decoupling, and over diversify, not decoupling. And but again, it's how people can accomplish this, and that is up in the air.
Okay, you're right. Why are we like the 1930s? Because what Professor Ma said, we have attitudes in the United States and China that are not responding to this changing situation. From my point of view, if you acknowledge that China's economy faces powerful headwinds and is less of a threat, we should try and reduce the hostility and find ways to restore cooperation. That's not the tack that's being taken. Rather, it's we're in competition with China. We need to take advantage of their weakness. That's the kind of thinking that leads to war. And the part of China, China's economic model providing a lot of freedom to firms and local governments to explore and find any pathway to growth. The local governments would raise money by land sales. They would lend that money to local firms that were seeking to expand, and the firms would develop their technology and markets. And it was a good system as long as the population was growing. But now that the this is where the demography is not just one of many factors, as the questioner said, but is actually a primary factor. If the population is not growing, then the demand for housing starts to decline. It's already happening. And that means it's hard for local governments to make money by selling more land to developers. Not only that, the existing banking system needs to be recapitalized because it's holding a lot of bad mortgages on properties that are only partly built or vacant. You have a lot of families whose savings are tied up in real estate that's declining. Now, China's savings rate is about 45%. That's twice that of other developed countries. For China's economy to get back on track of rapid growth, they would need to increase consumption, but that would require diverting spending to local services and higher value services, not manufacturing. The government doesn't seem inclined to promote that. And the government also needs to kind of preside over a shift to expand the private sector, which is more efficient, and let the state-owned sector decline. But both promoting consumption, promoting larger scale professional services, and expanding the private sector at the expense of the state-owned sector would all mean reducing the CCP's control of the economy. They don't want to do that. And so that kind of puts shackles on how fast China can recover growth. And in terms of youth unemployment, if the economy's growth is slow, but there are a lot of people that are employed by firms and this government in white-collar jobs who are now in these very large cohorts in their 40s that are going to stay on for another 10 or 20 years, there's no expansion, and the firms are top-heavy, so there are no openings at the entry level for young people coming out of college. And that's just a situation where, again, if the population were expanding and the administration had to grow and firms had to grow, there'd be opportunities for new market entrants. But that's not what's happening. You have demographically top-heavy organizations across China in a period of slowing growth, and that means there aren't jobs. Now, there are jobs in factories. If young people want to be truck drivers or factory operatives, there's a real labor shortage for people there. But that's because China has shifted from being an economy where lots of peasants are coming from the countryside to factory jobs in the city. That's not happening. Instead, you have millions of college graduates coming out looking for white-collar jobs. And the Chinese economy is not providing that, probably won't provide that. So you're going to find that young joblessness leads into more delay of marriage, which leads into lower fertility. And it's a really difficult cycle that China is struggling to break out of. I do not know quite how they're going to do it without a real change in direction, a real change in the principles by which the party runs the country. And I don't see that happening. So again, what worries me about the world being like the 30s is that governments are becoming more aggressive, more committed to the viewpoint that worked for them in the past. And that's leading them away from finding new cooperative solutions for creating global cooperation and shared governance. It worries me. It's kind of, the world of the 1930s needed the organizations of the 1940s, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, to bring countries together. But now we're reversing that. Those organizations are losing clout, losing influence. Countries are seeking their own way. And it's kind of like we're moving back from the 1940s to the 1930s. I wish it wasn't happening. If you guys have ideas about how to change that, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Jack, for the insights, although it's very depressing. Professor Zhou, would you respond to the question? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of questions. One is the money and what is the incentive for innovation. I think, Silicon Valley's model with the stockholder, stock shares and so on has been commonly thought to Silicon Valley, therefore, heard about innovation, or perhaps there are other ways to think about what is innovation, what is the impact, social impact of innovation, how people do innovation. So I would highly recommend people look into Kai-Fu Lee's work on AI superpower, and he has other books, and Kai-Fu Lee is quite credited in terms of China's innovation, AI scientists and so on being very deeply ingrained in Silicon Valley and in China. So to think about, and he was very clear that yes, IP protection in China is completely not good. Copy is the mainstream, yet in that context, innovation happens in very rapid speed. So what exactly is incentivize these people? So I just want to see that every country, as a geographer, has a different way of imagining what works for them. So do not impose single model. So that's one thing I would say. In terms of how did China's government do, I have no disagreement in the sense that Chinese government became more authoritarian for sure, that it did crack down on the companies, but there's also, the certain type of companies, the company scenario in China has also changed quite rapidly. So I don't think even the same recipe 20 years ago would work in today's China. It just doesn't. So how does this play out? I don't know about this 统一大市场. I have an intuitive disagreement with that, but again, so I think the only thing that works for China is the government, in many cases imposing or an idea and then being pushed back subtly, not overtly, but subtly pushed back, and that happens so many times in history. I have no. I cannot say it would never happen under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping would never ever been pushed back, but in fact, many of his initiatives did not go through. So I think one has to really be open-minded and see what the Chinese enterprises are doing. And just recent statistics I got in terms of R&D spending among all enterprises, including the state-owned, non-state-owned, Chinese non-state-owned companies spending 94% of R&D. Okay, so they are the ones who are interested in innovation. So I also just really want to think about the demographic a little more, because my circle, people are worrying about there's not enough jobs for people with AI. Just take the robotics, for example, right? China had a lot of popular labor, so it did not do robotics until almost in 2004-5, when the labor shortage started. At that time, China has 3% robotic, right? By 2010, China have 12% of the global robotic installation. By 2022, China has more robotics than the rest of the world combined. So labor shortages changes the ways in which companies calculate their investment in capital, right? So if we say that, okay, lack of young people is a problem, I totally agree. Well, but I also think that demographically, China won't, women won't have more children. So that's my idea, regardless what the CCP has to say. So, however, we're looking at a scenario, large number of older people. Now you see what is companies invested in? Various robots for elderly care, right? So I mean, like, you have a large number of entrepreneurs responding to different scenario. What did that make China going to be a consumer market in aging care, medical equipment, drugs of various kind? So you see a huge movement toward that direction. Did the government know that? Well, they sort of, but to say they are the ones to initiate that, I'm just completely wrong, right? So I think, AI is going to change the world. So I think we better keep that in mind.
Okay, so we are already out of time, but maybe we can let Professor Jack Goldstone to respond to the final question, from Edward Marx. They already put the question on chat. Jack, would you want to say a few words? I saw you type something.
No, I think what's been said is very clear. Let me say this. China is putting all of its eggs in the basket of advanced technology. They are hoping that by continuing to make progress in robotics and AI, they can overcome their demographic challenges, overcome the hostility and opposition of the West, and position themselves as a leading power. If they have a breakthrough that allows their AI to be transformative, that allows them to produce robotics at such an economical rate that they can use robots for elder care, that could change things. But my assumption is that in the next 25 years, human beings will still be needed to pave the streets and to take care of older people and to landscape and do a lot of services, so that it's not, after 2050, who knows what the world will be like. But for the next 25 years, I think, robotics and AI will replace a lot of factory labor and a lot of routine white collar labor, but there will still be a need for people in service jobs. And if the service sector doesn't expand enough, you'll have a lot of youth unemployment still. So I don't think we can count on AI and robotics to totally change the discussion we're having, but we have to acknowledge that it's too simple-minded to think that China will not adjust. China will certainly adjust. The question is how rapidly they adjust to conditions that are changing very rapidly as we speak. And that is where I think the concern and uncertainty lie.
For years. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jack.